Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, we're getting back to my Danish roots. We're going all the way back to one of my great-grandfathers, in fact, Ditlevsen, who actually was the man who carved Mount Rushmore, which is highly problematic for me. I love a lot of his work. That is a work that I have many, many problems with, but he is the man responsible for my Danish heritage. The way we are going to manifest that today is by talking about the Copenhagen Trilogy by Tove Ditlevsen. I have to admit that I was surprised there were not more podcasts about Tove Ditlevsen and the Copenhagen Trilogy, but I will say that one I listened to taught me essentially how to say her name. I was saying Tove Ditlevsen, which as I'm saying it out loud, it makes much more sense to say Ditlevsen. He said a bunch of interesting things, actually, packed a lot into those 2 minutes. But the most important, perhaps, was how to pronounce her name. It also makes me realize that as far as Scandinavia goes, my pronunciation is really not good. I was also mispronouncing Tove Jansson. That is how I have been saying it. I think now it is Tove Jansson. Maybe it's Jansson. Maybe it's Jansson. Who knows? Actually, someone knows. Just I don't know. But we always start with this question of why read this book. I obviously was drawn to it because of my Danish heritage, but this is a book that I bought a long time ago when it first came out and it got lots and lots of buzz. And I have to say, I opened it then and I read the first couple of pages, and it was actually not too long after my mom had died. And my mom was amazing in many, many ways, but we had a fairly complicated relationship. And when I read those first few pages and realized that this trilogy was really going to be steeped in the idea of the mother, I just kind of felt like I couldn't handle it then. Flash forward a couple of years, and my husband was going to Copenhagen to do some fundraising, and I just stowed away. I stowed away in the luggage. And I hadn't been in Copenhagen since I was 12 years old. I was so excited to go there. I only got to spend 18 hours in that city, but I really tried to max it out. In fact, if you are on YouTube, I'll show you some of the pictures that I took on the little jog that I took while I was in Copenhagen for 12 hours. I read the book in anticipation of the trip, and I also stopped into 2 different bookstores. Maybe it was the street that we were on, but Copenhagen has the most incredible array of bookstores. And sure enough, the bookstore that I popped into, Tove Ditlevsen, was everywhere in this bookstore. Again, if you're on YouTube, I'll put up a couple of pictures. I kept taking pictures of all of the displays that had her front and center. And it was some point during the trip that I realized the best way to talk about this book. So what happened is I read the Copenhagen Trilogy and I was just left cold. I was left cold in actually kind of a harrowing way, which is the sign of a very effective memoir. I found this book actually very difficult to read. That was mostly because of the stuff in the last part, the third book of the trilogy called Dependence, which, as you might imagine, has everything to do with dependency on drugs. And I am someone who has quite a bit of drug addiction and alcoholism in my family. It was a little harrowing to read that last book. And I really found it, in fact, very heavy. But my experience of the first 2 books in the trilogy was kind of different. It was like I understood some of the draw and I really enjoyed some parts of it, but I was just left feeling like there was this big gap between my expectation for this memoir and all of the hype for the memoir and my actual experience of reading it. So my sense, even as I was reading through and not fully, loving this book, my sense was that part of what was lacking is that I hadn't read any of her fiction. This is someone who wrote 29 books, short stories, lots of poetry, longer form fiction, memoir. She's someone who was prolific and clearly is the mainstay of Danish literature and has huge acclaim all through the literary world. And my thinking was that if I had read some of her fiction, or if I were to read some of her fiction, that I would have much more appreciation for the memoir. So that is exactly what I did. I got a couple of little collections, I read them, all of them were short stories. And today, what we are going to do, it's slightly different. Today, we're going to take a look at a story called The Umbrella. And I was so pleased when I read it because it was exactly what I hoped. Once I had read even that one first story, it's a very brief, sorry, that huge noise was my dog coming through the dog door. this very brief story really opened up the memoir for me. It really added depth, it added interest, it added engagement. And I was really excited to talk about the fiction in order to more fully appreciate the memoir. The other element of the memoir that we are going to look at today, and this was fascinating to me, is that my first instinct that this is a book that was steeped in the mother and also steeped in the idea of maternity and, in fact, kind of the problematic nature of maternity, that was absolutely true. The book is very, very focused on motherhood. I would say, I keep saying the mother, and what I mean by that is like we're really focusing on the presence of mothers here, more so, I think, than from the perspective of a daughter, a bit more so than we are talking about the experience of being a mother. The trilogy does encompass childhood, obviously, and then youth and dependence. In it, we do see Tove Ditlevsen. I think that's right. I think I did it. We see her have 3 children, and it was a fascinating depiction of maternity. So what I want to look at today in terms of the memoir is to look very briefly at a couple of very important elements. And once we've seen the depiction of the mother and like the really dominant role that the mother plays, we're then going to look at the way that Ditlevsen is depicting motherhood. So what I want to talk about in that regard is this idea of the art monster. This idea of the art monster comes from a woman named Jenny Offel, Offil, not awful, awful. Actually, I've never heard her name pronounced. I'm assuming it's pronounced awful. But she had this idea of the art monster, that male artists are allowed to be these kind of, like temperamental geniuses, and they're able to shirk responsibility in all sorts of ways, but mostly domestic ways. They're kind of like the artistic genius who can get away by treating everyone very badly because they are in fact churning out art that is deemed to be highly esteemed by culture. What's interesting to think about, and there's a woman named Lauren Elkin who has done some thinking on this, is what happens when that person is a woman. I mean, clearly, if you are a woman and society has expectations that you are going to be the primary caregiver and the homemaker and someone who is supporting, potentially a husband who is maybe the father of the children, that it is particularly transgressive if you have a woman who is really putting her art front and center and is really dedicating herself to the production of her art at the expense of her family. What was so fascinating to me is that this book, the trilogy itself, was published, the first 2 books in 1967 and the last one in 1971. It's interesting, that just like really straddles my birth year right there. But in many ways, this book would have been absolutely revolutionary. And one of the ways is the way that it treats maternity. This is a woman who truly is living for her art. I mean, honestly, we see her do very little mothering. And in many ways, that's entirely appropriate. But I am interested in the fact that we have a narrator of a memoir here. We have Tove Ditlevsen herself speaking so much about the role of her own mother. And in many ways, I mean, it's very logical. I think if you really dove into this deeply, which we are not going to do, I mean, I'm talking like if you wrote a dissertation on this, you could really dig into the ways that she's repeating her mother's absence, that they're, I mean, I am not a psychologist here, and I'm not going to get too much into the armchair psychology of the whole thing. But we're just going to take a look at the ways that maternity is so central, both in the fiction and also in the Copenhagen trilogy. But the depiction of Ditlevsen as a mother to her 3 children is really like impressive in the sense that it's really, it has nothing to do with this memoir that really defines her life. In many ways, dependence is just about the power of the need for that drug, but it also speaks to her ambition. So we're going to take a look at that. Okay, it's a little late in the lecture to be giving you an agenda, but first we're going to do like a super brief bio of Tove Ditlevsen. Then we're going to talk about the presence of the mother and then maternity in the novel, in the memoir. And then we're going to take a look at The Umbrella, which is just one of her very slim short stories. But in many ways, I did read the entire collection. In many ways, it is typical of the sort of themes and the sort of prose and the kind of emphasis on symbolism, actually, that we see throughout the entire collection. So Tove Ditlevsen was born in 1917. She died in 1976. It took me so long to do that math. It really should not have taken me that long. She died when she was 59 years old. She was born in Copenhagen and grew up in a working class milieu there, which is very obvious if you have read this book. I'm stopping for a moment to think if there's spoilers. I don't think there are any spoilers here. We're looking at a fairly specific kind of vein of the memoir. I mean, I guess it's a spoiler that she has kids and becomes a mother. But what we're talking about are sort of her thoughts about maternity more so than we are talking about specific incidents in the work. She had 4 marriages, she had 3 children, and again, she wrote 29 books. I actually just went onto Wikipedia to double check that she has 3 children, and the little AI thing that got generated said she has at least 2 children. So I'm not the only one who's a little confused about that. My feeling from a passage that we're actually going to look at is that there are 3 children. The thing that stands out a bit, though, in this kind of in this line of numbers that I just gave you, is the fact that she was incredibly prolific. These 29 books were not only the focus of her life, at least insofar as we gather from the trilogy itself, but they also led to a huge amount of critical acclaim in Denmark, and really she became just an enormously important person in the country. As I said before, the Copenhagen Trilogy in Danish, it came out in 1967, the first 2 books, and then 1971, and it came out in 2022 in the United States. So we're going to go ahead and dive in today by taking a look at the very beginning of the memoir. And as I said before, it is absolutely focused on the presence of the mother. This is actually tipping us off. Any of you who are here in order to become a better reader, the thing I always say to people is you simply should pay more attention. One of the things that you should pay lots of attention to is the opening of any book. If it is something that is a challenging book in any way, that first paragraph, the first sentence, should really be telling you a lot about what you can expect stylistically, where you want to focus your attention. Sometimes there's some real hidden gems in the beginning, but this one honestly just kind of hits you over the head with the presence of the mother. Ultimately, that is totally indicative of this focus on the mother throughout, and it's a focus on a mother who is highly, highly problematic. So we're going to take a look on page 3. It reads this: "In the morning there was hope. It sat like a fleeting gleam of light in my mother's smooth black hair that I never dared touch. It lay on my tongue with the sugar and the lukewarm oatmeal I was slowly eating while I looked at my mother's slender folded hands that lay motionless on the newspaper on top of the reports of Spanish flu and the Treaty of Versailles. My father had left for work and my brother was in school, so my mother was alone, even though I was there. And if I was absolutely still and didn't say a word, the remote calm in her inscrutable heart would last until the morning had grown old and she had to go out to do the shopping in Istedgade like ordinary housewives." So again, today we're not going to be doing a lot of close reading. We're looking more at sort of the content here. But the presence of the mother is really dark. We have this child who is trying to eat her breakfast, but the focus, just like the crazy focus here, is the mother. We're looking at different aspects of her dark hair, her hands. She's kind of not coming together as a person. And literally, she uses the word inscrutable. This is a woman who cannot be understood by her daughter. In fact, it is her inscrutable heart. I mean, right from the beginning, we are told that this is a very complicated woman. Also, in the beginning, things feel so tense. It feels like very unsafe in this situation. This is a young girl who's by herself. Her older brother and father out of the house. She's left with her mother, and this woman is highly unpredictable and in many ways just an incredibly oppressive force. It's interesting to me too when I go back and reread. We have here the Spanish flu and the Treaty of Versailles. So the Spanish flu is 1918, and Ditlevsen was born in 1917. So we have ourselves situated in history, and it is the presence of the mother who is reading this newspaper, it's like the mother is like the conduit to history. And so on some level, you have the presence of the mother being set on the same scale as the Spanish flu and the Treaty of Versailles. It's really interesting to think about the power that this woman wields. And this power we see, it's palpable throughout the entire thing. The mother is this really suffocating presence throughout all the way through childhood and all the way through youth. And even when we have instances where she's sort of feeling like she's pulling away from the mother, the focus is still on the mother and whether or not she has a little bit of distance from the mother. For example, on page 96, "I think about the fact that once the most important thing in the world was whether my mother liked me. But the child who yearned so deeply for that love and always had to search for any sign of it doesn't exist anymore. Now I think that my mother cares for me, but it doesn't make me happy." So this really gets to the crux of the whole thing. You have this desire for a mother's attention and a mother's love, and then finally when something, approximate to it arrives, it still isn't making the author happy. So that part was from childhood. And in youth, we have the mother as this central figure, even as Ditlevsen is starting to engage with men. The mother's presence is just absolutely permeating the whole thing. This is now in dependency. And what we have here is her really questioning the role that marriage is going to take in her life. She has 4 different marriages, and the first one is highly strategic in the sense that she is seeing the first person that she marries. She's seeing him as a way, as an entree into the literary world. But what's so interesting is the power of this man, the power of someone who can allow her to achieve her dream of making it in the literary world is compared with the desires that the mother has for her daughter to become married. So she says this: maybe I didn't really have to marry Vigo F to make it in the world. Maybe I only did it because my mother wanted me to so badly. And then right across the page, during this period, I feel very close to my mother, and I'm not harboring any deep or painful feelings about her anymore. Which honestly, like when, she doth protest too much in some ways. Every time we see her saying something positive or even like slightly positive about her mother, here it's, she says she's feeling good about her mother, but the way that she's expanding on that is like an absence of terrible feelings about the mother. It's not all that convincing. So this presence of the mother is, again, very palpable throughout the entirety of the memoir. And what's really interesting, which we'll see a little bit of this, I think we will, in the umbrella, is that the mother, the mothers in general, are pervasive also in the fiction. So I want to move from this idea of her mother as being like a totally unreliable source of any kind of love or affection or sense of self, the things that a mother maybe should provide for her daughter. I want to move from that to this idea of the art monster. So from the very beginning, I mean, this is a book, in some ways it's weird to be talking about maternity, as a focus in the book, because this is a book that really pushes against the idea of women as sort of like being defined by motherhood. There are parts in the book where Ditlevsen really does want to be a mom. She's very excited about the idea of having a baby, although very quickly there's a lot of ambivalence about it. But what's most fascinating to me, and honestly, in some ways, this felt like very feminist and like weirdly kind of inspirational to me. I mean, I was not giving her like a lot of kudos for the way that she was parenting, but I was fascinated and also kind of like glad that there's some examples of women who are also art monsters. I mean, this is a woman, if you are Danish, you maybe would think that it's fine that she wasn't like Mother of the Year because she turned out just absolutely incredible prose that moved many, many people. So we see this ambivalence and her like entree into motherhood as being very problematic right from the start. So on 268, this is even during her pregnancy. And this is a sentence that's kind of stuck into the middle of a passage that's actually mostly about her ambition. I don't think I've ever seen a pregnant woman as fat as me. I'm afraid that I'm going to have a huge baby with water on the brain. So this is not some sort of radiant, pregnant woman thing where she's looking so much toward being a mom. She's actually like worried in a way that's kind of all about her. Like she's so fat, she's worried she's going to have a huge baby. I mean, honestly, she might also just be worried about her vagina. That's a legit concern. So then a little further down, like literally like 3 sentences down, so very close to this description of her as a pregnant woman, we have this. In the middle of all this, I get interviewed by Carl Bjarnhof. Well, apologies for the Danish pronunciation here. I get interviewed by Carl Bjarnhof for the Social Demokraten. I get a shock when I see the headline. And then quotation marks. I want money, power, and fame. Did I really say that? The entire interview gives an unflattering impression of me. I'm portrayed as a vain, ambitious, and superficial person who only thinks about herself. And I have to say, when she says it like that, I was not particularly surprised. I mean, I didn't see her as vain. I just saw her as someone who was very ambitious and who really wanted success and wanted her writing to have an audience. I certainly didn't see her as superficial because she was someone who was very intensely involved with people and very intensely in tune, which is evident right from the start because she has to be, because her mother is very problematic. But in many ways, it is a memoir that's very, it's very much about a woman who is following her dream, which kind of by definition ends up feeling like someone who is really mostly concerned about herself. So we have this description of her being hugely pregnant. Then we have this big chunk that's about ambition. And then at the bottom of the page, We return to the pregnancy, and it's almost kind of an afterthought. Finally, one morning, I have a stomach ache, and I ask Mrs. Hanson if it could be contractions. She thinks it probably is, and it gets worse as the day progresses. Ebba holds my hand as the contractions come. That evening, we go to the clinic, and he says goodbye with a sad, helpless expression. Then we have a space break. So in many ways, she's erased here. We have the idea of this Mrs. Hanson character, and then we have this idea of her husband who is holding her hand and then who is leaving her. So we have lots of abandonment here. And she is really kind of like not present, which is significant because she's being kind of eclipsed by the idea of maternity. And then it's fascinating because we have the husband leaving, we have the space break, and then we have this. She's so ugly, I say, surprised, looking down at the little bundle of a baby in my arms. Her face is pear-shaped with 2 dark marks on her temples from the forceps. There's not a hair on her head. The doctor laughs. That's just because you've never seen a newborn baby before, he said. They're never cute. But the mother usually thinks so anyway. That actually really made me laugh. I was like, gosh, there is some truth in that. Little babies are they're so crazy, like the teeny tiny ones. But it's so amazing that, she's saying she's so ugly to the doctor, and he's laughing at least. It's not clear if she's just like actually repelled by the baby, but in many ways, in the beginning, at least, she is. And then we have her husband reacting to the baby. She's pretty chubby, he says, and I feel offended. I say, is that all you have to say? The birth took 24 hours, and I swore I would never have a baby again. I yelled and screamed in pain, and all you have to say is that she's chubby? So this is interesting too, because immediately, she's offended that he says that. But the thing that she's offended about is that he doesn't appreciate what she has just been through. So she's not defending the baby and saying like, our daughter is so amazing. She's just like, do you know what I have just been through? So in many ways, the presence of that little part where she is, accused of being self-absorbed, what it says actually here is that she's someone who thinks only about herself. This is true here, even, it's right across the page here. And absolutely, she has every right to be angry that he's not understanding the horror that she has been through in terms of childbirth. But it is interesting that the presence of the baby is not the important thing here. It's really her own experience. So a little further down, I bend over the cradle and touch the tiny fingers. I say, now we are a father, mother, and child, a normal, regular family. Ebba asks, why do you want to be normal and regular? Everyone knows you're not. I don't know how to answer him, but I've wanted that as far back as I can remember. So this is so significant. It is so interesting to me the many times we're here, for example, when she's saying like, I have always wanted to be normal, but she's not saying that she is normal. I mean, she's kind of trying to convince herself and her husband that she's normal. And what they are talking about here is her ambition, is her single-minded focus on writing and all of the things that she has been doing in order to have her dream come true. So in this passage about, childbirth, about her becoming a mother, we have this real sense, this real struggle between, becoming a mother and then her real sense of her own experience. And when we do see the baby, it's not with a lot of love and affection. It's actually things that are fairly critical. And I would be remiss if I did not note that she does at some point seek an abortion. This is terrible. God, my memory is so bad. I mean, I did read this like 10 days ago. I can't remember if she actually does have an abortion. I think she does. I am obviously someone who really believes that a woman should be able to make a choice about her body. And I'm fascinated with this idea, again, fitting into this notion of women who are really ambitious. And in many ways, it's really strong and very refreshing to have her really true to her dream and to speak about the fact that she was not ready to become a parent again. So on 288, there are a series of pages here where she's really very clear about maternity as not being complementary to her ambition. So on page 288, we have this. Men seem to be excluded from my world right now. They're foreign creatures. It's as if they came from another planet. They're not in touch with their bodies. They don't have any tender, soft organs where a blob of slime can attach itself like a tumor and, completely independent of their volition, start living its own life. Oh my God. So she just likened an embryo to a blob of slime and a tumor. So one of the things that is so incredible about this memoir is the candor. This is someone who is not afraid to tell us exactly what she's thinking. And this is a very good example of that. So actually, yes, this is the part where she is considering having an abortion. So down a little further, slightly relieved, I tell Lisa that Nadia has promised to get me some quinine pills, but Lisa isn't so enthusiastic. She says, I've heard that some people go blind and deaf from those. I say that I don't care as long as I get rid of this. I mean, that's a pretty clear statement of someone who really does not want to become a mother for the second time. And in fact, across the way at the bottom of the next paragraph, tomorrow at this time, I say, I will be happier than I ever have been in my entire life. And that is very interesting too, because I mean, this is really speaking to the magnitude of her not of her non-desire, that's not the right word, of how much she really does not want to add more maternity to her life. I would also be remiss in saying that there are some passages where she does enjoy being with her children. It's not that we never ever see her enjoying maternity, but we do not see a lot of it. And often when we do, it's in situations like this where there's a lot of either ambivalence or like downright despair at the idea of having to mother. So later in Dependence, when we see her in the most dire stages of her addiction to drugs, we have some passages about her children that really speak to the way that her desire for the drug really incapacitates her and is so all consuming that her children are sort of an afterthought. So on 339, we have this. No price was too high to be able to keep away intolerable real life. A little further down, while I was lying there alone in my bed, I realized that it had been a long time since I had seen my children. I walked down the stairs and into their room. I was so weak I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. I turned on the light and looked at them. Hella was lying with her thumb in her mouth and her curls like a halo around her head. Michael was sleeping with his kitten in his arms. He couldn't sleep without it. And Trina was lying with her eyes open, watching me soberly with a child's inscrutable face. Wow, fascinating that the inscrutable face here is a bit of an echo of the mother's inscrutable heart at the very beginning of the memoir. A little bit further down, I almost didn't recognize these children anymore. I wasn't a part of their daily routine. And then at the end of this chapter, and this is actually when she starts being able to write again a little bit, then I had a clear thought for the first time in a long while. If things get really bad, I thought, I'll call Gert Jorgensen and tell him everything. I wouldn't do it just for the sake of my children, but also for the sake of the books that I had yet to write. So this is so fascinating because here we really are seeing her understanding that she is totally disconnected from her children. So she wants to be connected to the children. Part of the reason why she would try to stay sober is for her children, but also, and kind of like, it's not more importantly, but the way syntactically, the way that this sentence works, we have, yes, for sure for the children, but she's saying, but also for the books that I had yet to write. And the fact that the books come second, in my mind, because of the way sentences work, all of the momentum of the sentence is moving toward the end. And the idea that she's ending this whole chapter with is this idea of books that she has yet to write. That is really where the emphasis lies. So before we dive into the story, I just want to take a moment to sort of summarize my thinking on this. By no means am I like talking about maternity in this way as a criticism of Tove Ditlevsen. I was going to say Tove Jansson. I was actually fascinated by this portrayal of how important the mother figure is, and then the ways that being a mother absolutely does not fit well into this puzzle of ambition. So even before we have drug abuse, which clearly is going to really impair your ability to parent well, we have a very clear sense that her ambition and her drive are really not compatible with having children. And maybe one of the things that was most impressive to me is how candid she is about that. I mean, there is so much candor about everything in this memoir, all of which I really loved. And when I say art monster, in the case of Tove Ditlevsen, it's a specific kind of thing because most of the time we're talking about men who can be art monsters because society allows them to be, also because generally they're not the primary caregiver of their children. And so it was really actually kind of amazing to see the ways that a woman who had huge critical acclaim and who was hugely successful as a writer was in some ways, sort of hewed close to this idea of like what this art monster is like. And in many ways, people probably vilify her even more. Obviously, if a mother decides to dedicate herself entirely to her work society has a very hard time with that. So now that we've talked about the trilogy, we're going to talk about this incredible story called The Umbrella. And I'm going to just kind of tell you what happens in the story. It's very short. If you want to go and read it, maybe you can do that and then come back. But I can also just tell you kind of I mean, honestly, like it is one of these stories that has so much resonance, but is very simple. What we have is a woman named Helga who has very high expectations of the world and who is often disappointed. And she decides that if she has an umbrella, that her life will be much better. So she does, in fact, go out and buy an umbrella, and this is like a huge extravagance, and it transforms her. And then her husband breaks the umbrella, and then at the end, he says, "You will buy another umbrella." And the thing that is most important here, and that I really would like for you to be able to take away, is this idea that there is so much autobiography. If I were someone who read this story, it's just a beautiful story. It's subtle and powerful and has a huge amount of symbolism. It's really beautifully done, although it's not radically different from the prose in the trilogy. It's prose that's very straightforward, it's very stripped down, but it has beautiful resonance because in fact there is a lot of symbolism. There also is just this beautiful arc that really, it's talking about a husband breaking an umbrella, but it's talking about much more. By the way, when I'm talking about symbolism and we're talking about an umbrella, it's very important to read that as a phallic symbol. So in many ways, an umbrella, it's long, it's very much like a phallus. But the umbrella is really interesting because it's also like a vaginal symbol, because when you open it, it has that kind of opening. So in many ways, it has to do with male power, but also with female power. In this case, it also is the idea of an umbrella is particularly important to her because of having seen a woman carrying an umbrella when she's young. We'll get to that. And my copy is actually, it's Tove Ditlevsen, The Trouble with Happiness. It's a Penguin modern classic. And the umbrella is actually the first story. And on page 3, we have this. Helga had always, unreasonably, expected more from life than it could deliver. People like her live among us, not differing conspicuously from those who instinctively settle their affairs and figure out precisely how, given their looks, their abilities, and their environment, they can do what they need to do in the world. So right from the beginning, of course, we have this idea of a young woman. This is very similar to the sort of focus that we have, obviously, in the trilogy. And we have this idea of someone who has expectations for the world that are outsized. They're sort of too much. They're beyond average. The difference between Helga and Tove is that Helga is only kind of like average in these departments, meaning average in looks and average in intelligence. But we have this beautiful stripped down prose that's very much like the Copenhagen trilogy. I love that part where she says, people like her live among us, not differing conspicuously from those who, and then on and on. This idea of us, there's a very beautiful thing there where we have this kind of direct address here, like people live among us. You're joining with the author in a way that's very powerful. But otherwise, this is a narrator who's a third person narrator, is omniscient, is very traditional in many ways, and is distanced in a way that allows that narrator to have a lot of authority and make these kinds of pronouncements. So we find out that Helga is kind of an average person. And then she gets married to someone and he's very demanding. And this is fine for a little while. And then we come to this passage that's very interesting where the umbrella is introduced in the story. By the way, very important to think about the title of the story. I love the fact that the collection itself is called The Trouble with Happiness. That is such an amazing title. It is also the title of the last story in this collection, but it is so provocative and interesting. So the umbrella, if we have the first story in the collection and the title is The Umbrella, obviously we are supposed to be focusing all of our attention on the umbrella. So when it does finally appear, not finally, but about halfway through this little short story, it appears, and when it does, it's linked with the mother. So we have this on page 6. Her mother had never owned an umbrella. You took the wind and the weather as it came without imagining that you could indulgently protect your precious hair and skin from the rain, which spared nothing else. So what we have here is this idea of a mother who is really very ascetic and very kind of stoic, and who's also saying that that your hair is not precious, that you don't deserve protection, that you have to just suffer. And so the idea of the umbrella here really becomes symbolic also of this idea of self-protection and of being having enough self-worth to be something that is worthy of protection. So not only is it a phallic symbol, but it's very directly related to the mother in the sense that it's providing protection that the mother is denying the child. So then right across the page here, the image that arose from her memory was this. She was about 10, sitting in the window of the family bedroom looking down into the courtyard, which, if you have read the trilogy, that will be very resonant for you, because this is highly autobiographical. When she's little, Tove, she sleeps in her parents' room, and she often sits in the windowsill, like on a, I'm imagining kind of like a little window seat kind of a situation, and she looks down into the courtyard. And there's a woman you all will remember from the trilogy who I think probably was the direct inspiration for the next passage that we see. So she's looking down into the courtyard. Suddenly, she saw the gate open, and across the wet cobblestones of the courtyard, onto which raindrops splashed in an excited rhythm, strolled a pretty, dreamlike creature. Her long yellow dress nearly touched the ground, and high above a profusion of silky blonde curls floated an umbrella. It was not like the one Helga's grandmother used, round, black, and dome-shaped with a solid handle, but a flat, bright, translucent thing which seemed to complement the person who carried it, like a butterfly's radiant wings. So she is not someone who's given to a lot of figurative language. So at the end, we have the simile about the butterfly's wings. When you have a writer who doesn't use a lot of figurative language, like, metaphor and simile, it's very important when they do. And this is so apt. It's so well done. A butterfly's wings are not only very beautiful, but they allow, a creature to fly. So in this case, we have this idealized vision of the umbrella. What's crucial is that it turns out when she tells her mother about this beautiful umbrella that she has seen and the woman in the yellow dress, it becomes very clear that the woman she's talking about is a sex worker, or at least, someone who is very sexually active, which you will also remember from the trilogy. So it's really important here that the woman who is at the center of this story, who wants the umbrella, the person that she's idealizing, that's not the word, yeah, maybe, that person who has inspired her is someone who is very sexually active. And you can read that as kind of like she's a little naive and she doesn't really know that. Like, really, it's kind of the adults are kind of laughing at her when she's 10 years old. But nevertheless, this is a woman who, yes, she might be a sex worker, or she's at least very sexually active. She's not like a lady, but this is someone who is really raised up because she has a certain amount of freedom. So not only is the presence of the mother really felt very strongly, even though Helga is a grown woman, but we also have this idea of Helga as not, in fact, being a mother. But the question of her becoming a mother is something that's relatively important, even in the span of this relatively short story. So on page 10, we have the following, but before I say that, there is a point in the trilogy where someone says you shouldn't have a child because women writers shouldn't have children, which is a really interesting endorsement, actually. I mean, she wants children and she has children, but there is someone who's saying to her, like, it's not compatible. Children are not compatible with the life, even of a woman writer, which is a very powerful thing that we see in the trilogy. It's kind of just like a thrown away comment by someone else, but it actually is someone that she's very much in love with. So its inclusion is actually very important. So on page 10, we have this. This is her husband talking to her. "You should have a kid," he said. "I damn well don't understand why it's not happening." Then she blushed, partly at her defiancy in that department, but more because she actually didn't mind not having a child. Her togetherness with her mother allowed the child Helga to live on within her. So it was as if there wasn't room for another one. Sometimes she lied to Egon when he asked if her mother had been over, because for some reason he didn't like her mother to visit so often when he wasn't home. So it's so interesting here. We have this idea of she's defiant. She doesn't actually want to have a child. And part of the reason for that is because she, in many ways, is still a child. Interestingly, when the narrator is describing that element, it's not that Helga herself recognizes that she is still a child and she wants to remain a child. And that could have been the case because in childhood, which is the first section of the trilogy, the narrator, Tove, really wants her childhood to endure. She really wants to be a child forever. There's so much about the sadness of the end of childhood. But in this case, the narrator is telling us that Helga is still a child in many ways, but Helga herself is not noticing that. So we have this idea of her like being defiant and kind of not wanting to have a baby. But the really important thing, which then becomes the bulk of this small paragraph, is the presence of the mother. So then Egon, the husband, starts drinking, and the mother actually tells her, like, the reason a man starts drinking is because he's not satisfied with his wife, which is insane. And then on page 15, we have this point when she's deciding that she's going to go out and buy an umbrella, and just the decision to do something that's frivolous, but that is, developed from her own agency, is completely transformative. So on 15, we have this. She wasn't the same person that she had been the day before. She was a woman walking into shops, looking at umbrellas. It took a long time to find the right one, and she carried it awkwardly on the way home, like a man who isn't used to carrying a bouquet of flowers. Once she was inside, she opened the umbrella and skipped around the apartment with it. Her joy was pristine. She walked just like the woman in the yellow dress from her childhood. This is so interesting. So we have this idea of her going home and skipping with joy, which to me is a very like childlike kind of thing. So throughout this, we see Helga really as someone who is very childlike. But we also, and we have this word pristine, her joy is pristine, which is in some contrast with the fact that she feels just like this woman who is like a symbol for some sort of sexual involvement. So we have this incredible transformation of this woman. And this is the kind of symbolism I'm talking about. I mean, you can say to yourself, like, what, like, why is she like completely transformed by this small act of buying an umbrella? But a lot of what happens in these short stories is a close examination of small things, small incidents, and small decisions that really are transformative for people. So the end of the story is the following. And what's interesting to me about it is pretty ambivalent. I mean, I love a short story that ends ambivalently, and this one is very satisfying in its ambivalence. So on page 18, we have this. He followed behind her and suddenly angrily pulled the fine object from her hands and broke it in half over his strong knee. So in many ways, we have to look at that as him being threatened. He doesn't like the fact that she's happy. He doesn't like the fact that she's happy because of something else. Also because in some ways she's taking back her power. Again, we have this phallic symbol. But she made, a small gesture that was really for herself, something that was just for her, and that did not sit well with him. So it goes on. So he breaks it over his strong knee, and we have this. There's your umbrella, he shouted, and she stood for a second in shock, staring at the pieces, at the cleverly formed ribs and the torn silk. Then she walked silently past him into the little living room, back to the manageable, the tolerable, the predetermined. She sat by the window as before, finally realizing that this was her place, and that everything was the way it was supposed to be. The colors in her memory mixed together, forming the beginning of a kind of pattern. She realized that she could never be the owner of an umbrella. It was only natural. It made sense that it was ruined. She had set herself up against the secret law steering her inner world. Few people, even once in their lives, dare to make the inexpressible real. It's so interesting, too, to look at that part, to just hear how much that resonates with the first paragraph. She is someone in the very beginning who is characterized by wanting more than she should. And in many ways, this is very dark, but this is really a story about the fact that most people's lives are very small, that wanting something larger than you have is generally not a good idea and is generally not going to end well. Helga smiled distantly at her husband. It was as if he had suddenly caused some string inside her to vibrate slightly, maybe because he had shown her the limits of her potential before it flowed out into nothingness. She didn't think about it like that. She just thought, this is exactly as if I had cheated on him and he's forgiven me. And she nodded, seriously and absently, as if to a child who wants to take a star down from the sky and give it away, when he, intensely occupied with her screwing a new bulb into the ceiling figure, said to her over his shoulder, "You'll get another umbrella." Fascinating. So incredibly powerful. So just to unpack a little bit here at the end, we have this sense of her as being very resigned in a way that is so shocking that I would think if you're Tove Ditlevsen, you're both criticizing a society, a patriarchy, where women really can't have expectations and can't want to have anything beyond, their station, because Helga is so, she's made so small by her situation and certainly, and mostly by her husband. And then it's so interesting that we have the idea of she's looking at a being, which we can read sort of as herself, who is a child. And then we have this beautiful, very symbolic vision of this idea of a child who is taking down a star. And then there's this kind of strange thing where we have this like kind of oblique description of the fact that suddenly her husband, who just broke the umbrella, is screwing in a new light bulb. So we have this idea of him as providing light. So we have the child taking down the light, taking down the star, and then we have the idea of the husband screwing in this light bulb, which I think you can, look at that as like the patriarchy reasserting itself, but you can also look at it as the idea that, her situation maybe is not so terrible. Like she has a husband who, yes, is problematic in many ways, but he is providing light. And then he looks over his shoulder, which is interesting. He's not turning directly toward her. He's kind of throwing this away. It's ambivalent. We're not really supposed to believe that this is like a real endorsement. And he says, and this is the last, it's the last line of the story, "You'll get another umbrella." So, I mean, my sense of that is that we are supposed to read it in an ambivalent way. I mean, it does end with that. I think most readers understand that she probably won't get an umbrella because, in fact, she is so resigned. I mean, we have this long paragraph and then another section of a long paragraph where she is really understanding that she is very hemmed in by her relationship and by her role as a wife. I just think this short story, I mean, all of them are like that. They're very simple. They're talking about these very quotidian things, but they all have this kind of like eerie kind of like you're really supposed to be reading them as not quite allegory, but like just really this kind of heady stuff, even though it is really situated certainly in the domestic sphere. And it's kind of shocking actually how much this is just, it's men and women and a lot of mothers and some children. There's actually a lot of concern about infidelity. There's a lot of concern about class. There's a lot of concern about the possibilities, like the opportunities for work. It is so similar and so autobiographical in so many ways. It's so satisfying. So the thing that I want to end with is this idea that literally, I mean, honestly, I kind of wish that I had read that short story, or maybe even the whole collection, before I read the Copenhagen trilogy. My sense is that most readers of English are just diving into the trilogy. And I think a lot of people are, really moved by it and really enjoying it, even though it's very dark and often difficult to read. But my sense is like, I wish they had maybe like included one of these very short stories, like even in an appendix, but ideally they would have it up front. Because as soon as you realize what she is doing in terms of her fiction, what she is doing with all of this fodder, all of this grist for her mill, meaning everything that's in the trilogy, it makes it so much more powerful. I mean, it's kind of like if we had, I don't know, like Faulkner or something. She's not like Faulkner in any way at all. But if we had some incredible short story writer, say it's Lori Moore, love Lori Moore. We need to do some Lori Moore here on the Fox page. But her short fiction is absolutely incredible. If she had like a big old 3-part memoir, I would just eat that up. I would just be so fascinated by every single element because I would be so steeped in the world of her brain and of her experience and of her like life vision. That's not even a word, but like I really feel in some ways like I know the inside of Lori Moore's brain, and I would love to know how she got to be the person she is. So it was very rewarding to read that small collection. It's very thin. The stories are very short, and they're so good. And this is one of those times when I'm so happy that I'm doing these lectures and that I have an excuse to like build myself a little syllabus and to really dig in to understand something. Like I wasn't totally satisfied with the trilogy. I didn't love it the way a lot of people loved it. And you all gave me an excuse to figure out why that was and then what I could do about it. So I really hope that this like little dive into the trilogy and then this companion piece in looking at this umbrella story has really helped you appreciate the genius of Tove. Wow, there I go, of Tove Ditlevsen. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.